Hello, human geographers. We are back at it this evening to take a look at our final lecture regarding agriculture. Still have one more to look at rural land use, but tonight we're going to mainly focus on the end of our agriculture unit. And we've looked at thus far the different types of agriculture, where they're practiced in the world, the different processes that go with them, why they are, where they are. Now tonight we're going to look at some of the impacts of that, some of the effects that can go along with agricultural systems. So we start out by looking at the ways that agriculture can change the landscape. And I want to start out with the definition of the cultural landscape because it is applicable here. Here's our definition. The visible imprint of human activity and culture on the landscape. The modifications to the environment by humans, including the built environment and agricultural systems that reflect aspects of their culture. So, agricultural systems influence the cultural landscape. So we have to be able to discern that. It is possible that we get an image of the cultural landscape and we have to be able to identify different aspects of it. So let's kind of talk about that. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot more that can go along with this. But here's some of the ones that we're going to talk about, and we'll take a look at in the next few slides. Terracing, which allows for cultivation on sloped terrain, hillsides, things like that. Typically on hillsides, if you try and cultivate on them, soil erosion is especially prominent because of the slope. And so terracing is one way that the landscape can be modified to allow for that. Irrigation projects allows water to come to areas without direct access. That can lead to increased cultivation. Deforestation, the loss of forests, especially and in particular rainforests. And then finally, the draining of wetlands, turning wetlands into agricultural land. So let's take a look at each of these individually. So we start out by terracing. This is an imaging of intensive wet rice terracing. And as you can see the slope of the hillside. And if you look in the background there, you can see other smaller hillsides as well. And how they're basically steps cut into this. So this allows for more land to come under cultivation. And we typically see it in areas with intensive cultivation, especially intensive wet rice cultivation. And again, terracing allows for land to come under cultivation without the same kind of erosion, soil erosion that we might see on a sloped hillside when soil runoff and the nutrients run off down the hillside. Terracing, we don't see the same kind of effect of that. Irrigation projects, this one is an image from India, and massive irrigation projects have allowed for more land to come under cultivation. And in some areas, it has allowed for double cropping of land, perhaps even triple cropping of land outside of the rainy season. In the case of India, as we saw in the video case study for Dikatpura, they're using the monsoon waters outside of the monsoon season. So they're allowing more land to come under cultivation. And in different times of the year when otherwise there wouldn't be enough rainfall to grow crops. And so that's allowing for more land to come under cultivation. Deforestation, in this case, the image that we see is the border between Brazil and Bolivia. And again, from our political unit, we mentioned that we can't see political boundaries from space, like the lines that are drawn on a map. But that doesn't mean that we can't see the impact of those lines. Laws in Brazil aren't nearly as restrictive on the clearing of trees as they are in Bolivia. In Bolivia, the laws are much more restrictive in terms of how much can be cut down and things like that. Brazil, they don't have that, nor do they really want that. And so we can see the impact here. So which side is Brazil? Which side is Bolivia? Hopefully, in taking a look at this, you're able to see that. And then finally, the draining of wetlands. And in this particular example, it's looking at an area in North Carolina called Washington County. On the map on the left, you can see it's kind of in the far northeast corner of North Carolina. And then they zoom in and they show the area that was wetlands and now is wetlands. And basically, very early on in the history of North Carolina, about 85% of this area in Washington County was covered in wetlands. But over time, those areas were drained in order to grow rice and corn in particular in this area. And so now, fast forward to the present day, only about 34% of Washington County is covered by wetlands. So again, the overarching theme on this is that the modification in the landscape is about bringing more land under cultivation, whether that is the clearing of trees, the draining of wetlands, the building of terraces into hillsides, bringing water to new areas. It's about increasing cultivation. And so we typically have seen greater modification of the landscape as a result of that. So shifting gears a little bit, we're going to take a look at some of the issues that can arise from agricultural practices, and in this case, for food deserts, also about urbanization. So we will talk about this topic again later, but we're introducing it now because it does relate to access to agricultural commodities. All right, and so we start out with our definition of a food desert, an area characterized by a lack of affordable, fresh, and nutritious food. Oftentimes, food deserts are characterized by lack of access to, in particular, fruits and vegetables. Those are the two that are most often associated with it. And food deserts we tend to find in rural areas, as well as in inner city areas, areas that were historically industrial areas, as well as what we will define in unit number 7, the central business districts. And so these inner city areas tend to be lower income, as well as much more densely populated. And so we tend to see a lack of grocery stores that are easily accessible. And so there's a lot that that factor into that. Now, where we tend to not see food deserts are in suburbs, because density is much lower, people are a lot more spread out, and we tend to see a lot more grocery stores in those areas. Plus, people can live further away from a grocery store and still be able to access it, because out in the suburbs we tend to see higher incomes and people having their own automobiles, for example, and being able to drive further to a grocery store, compared with one that you might have to walk to if you lacked a car or something like that. So, think about the grocery store that you and your family typically go to. Is it within walking distance? Maybe it is, but because we live out in the suburbs, it's more spread out. Chances are it's not, and that you typically drive to that grocery store. And so the mode of transportation can also have an impact on food desert and access to fresh and affordable food. So first thing that we look at here with this map is, the first question that we have, as always, is what type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing this? All right, and this is a Corpus map, and you should have noticed that we're looking within subnational units. You can see the boundary lines within the state of Nevada. We're looking at the county scale. All right. And so this particular map looks at the percent of people who lack convenient access to a supermarket. Now, there's a lot of questions that we may have as a result of this. What is convenient? Because convenience can mean a lot of different things. What is convenient when you have a car might not be nearly as convenient when you are walking or taking public transportation, things like that, or have to ride a bike. So convenience that's one question that immediately pops into my head in looking at this. What do we mean by convenient? How is that defined by whoever's doing this research? So let's take a look at the state of Nevada where we live. All of the counties that are the darker shade, that is more than 50% of the population, lacks access to a grocery store, supermarket, something like that. All right. All of the ones that are the darkest shade, meaning over 50%, are rural counties. Our two more urban counties, Clark and Washoe, less than 50%. But here's the problem. Can you guess what I'm going to say? What's the problem in looking at this map? In looking at this choropleth map, what's the problem? Well, there's only 2 classes. So here's the thing that I would say. Hey, you could have a county where 49% of the people lack access, and they're in the lower class. And a county where 51% of the people lack access, and they're in a different class. They both are very, very close and dealing with similar problems, but it looks completely different on this map. So again, how many choropleth classes would be ideal? How would this map change if we had 5 choropleth classes? How would this information change? Those are important questions to ask. Every time that we look at these maps, I want you guys to be critical of these maps. What are the problems with it? What would change if I changed the scale, if I changed the type of map, if I changed how many choropleth classes? I want you guys to be critical of this. That's what being a critical thinker is about, is questioning what we see here. All right? So question it. What are some other questions that this map generates for you? Take a moment, jot them down, jot down observations. Take a look at other parts of the country where we see large amounts of people lacking access to a supermarket. Now, let's change the scale a little bit. This image, also looking at food deserts, is created by GIS. All right, so this is Geographic Information Systems. And the layer that they have placed on top of here is what we call a heat map. All right. And so in this case, in this particular map, it's looking at grocery stores in Tucson, Arizona. And the population that can walk to that grocery store in 5 minutes. Now, if you notice on the left-hand side, since we are using GIS, we can interact with this information. We can change it. And there is a slide bar that would allow us to change the number of minutes that we're walking. This is on the lowest end. All right. What would happen if we changed it to 15 minutes? All right. The bubbles would get larger. All right. That would change that. Okay. So it's a heat map because the areas that are in green, those are going to have more easily or going to more easily be able to access those grocery stores. They're going to be able to walk there sooner. Whereas you get to the outer side of that bubble, it might be pushing that 5-minute mark. Okay. So this is a great example of a functional or nodal region because there's only so far that you can walk in 5 minutes. All right. Now, keep in mind that this is looking at areas where people are able to walk to a grocery store in 5 minutes. Not everyone has a car. And so in lower income areas, people might be walking to a grocery store. People might be taking public transportation or riding a bike or things like that. And so when you think about that, not only do you have to walk there, but you also have to walk back. So a 5-minute walk there doesn't sound that bad, but then you're 5 minutes walking back with all of the bags that you bought at the grocery store. So you're holding all of that and having to walk 5 minutes back. Okay, so 5 minutes isn't that bad. What about 15 minutes? Would you be able to carry all those bags walking back for 15 minutes? Maybe so, but is that a trip that you're willing to make on a fairly regular basis? And so they're trying to give an idea, to give us a situation that is as realistic as possible. All right, and then we would be able to change these bubbles to see the number of people. Now, again, everything outside of those bubbles would not be able to walk there in 5 minutes. And so those are the areas that are increasingly dealing with the lack of access to food. And so when you're unable to access fresh fruits and vegetables, where are you going then? Where are you going to get your food? Where are you going to get your nutrition, your calories? And typically what we see is we see more convenience stores. We see more fast food. And so what might be some of the problems when you're getting most of your groceries instead of from a grocery store where you can buy fresh fruit, produce, meat, breads, all these different things that you need for a balanced diet, and instead you're going to Walgreens, CVS, when you're going to a 7-Eleven, a McDonald's? What might be the difference in the way that people are living their lives as a result of that? And so that's why we're going to talk more about this in Unit 7 when we talk about part of the reason why we see this more in inner city areas. All right, because that might have been a question. Why inner city areas versus suburbs? And we are going to talk about that. There's kind of an explanation that leads us there. So this will come back up. Another issue for agriculture is dealing with sustainable agriculture. As more and more areas are brought under cultivation, the question of sustainability is brought up more and more. All right, sustainable agriculture is defined by this: farming methods that preserve long-term productivity of land and minimize pollution, typically by rotating soil restoring crops with cash crops and reducing inputs of fertilizers and pesticides. Typically, really what we've seen is some of the environmental issues that have come up have given rise to more sustainable practices. People have started to realize that some of the practices that we've been doing for years and years aren't sustainable. They aren't long-term without minimizing pollution. All right, that there might be a lot of outputs that are negative. And so some of the environmental issues that have caused this movement towards sustainability were things like soil degradation, removing too many of the nutrients from the soil, the loss of biodiversity, all right, the fact that we're starting to see more monoculture, all right, that leading to singular crops that are more susceptible to pests and disease, but as well as local communities that rely on it beginning to develop malnutrition because they're only eating one crop. Overgrazing, okay, which can lead to desertification. The reduction in rivers and aquifers, okay, the depletion of those resources as more irrigation canals are opened up. Animal waste, we talked about that with CAFOs. And the extensive use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, machines, all of these have environmental impacts that if they are continued to be practiced in this way and perhaps expanded as more and more countries become more developed, we're starting to see shifts in the way that people are engaging in agriculture. Is that sustainable? And that's been the problem, is that long term, it doesn't appear to be. So what we've seen develop out of these new practices, people changing their methods to be more sustainable and to open up new types of agriculture, is new kinds of agriculture. And so some of the ones that we want to introduce just very quickly is the organic farming movement, which is using more natural fertilizers as opposed to chemical fertilizers. So using some of that animal waste as opposed to fertilizers that might be produced from oil or some other chemicals in order to produce long-term sustainability. So this one is directly related to the sustainable agriculture movement. What is known as value-added specialty crops, the concept that more and more customers are willing to pay more for certain products. Okay, they know what they're getting into and they're willing to pay more. So we're starting to see a shift from the consumer side as well. And when consumers change, we're starting to see more and more producers make changes as well. So when people are willing to pay more for organic foods, well, we're going to start to see more people engage in organic farming. When we start to see more people pay for products that come from their local area, local farmers, family farmers in that area, we're starting to see more and more people maybe stay local instead of reaching out and becoming part of a larger agribusiness or national corporation, something like that. We're starting to see more fair trade policies, and essentially what fair trade is, there's several steps that go with this. Fair trade is essentially associated with a couple different aspects, helping to pay for the higher costs that go with smaller scale or organic farming. It tends to be a long-term commitment. Okay? And fair trade policies, we're starting to see more money paid up front so that smaller farmers, organic farmers, are able to be free from the dependence on high interest loans and things like that that are typically associated with commercial agriculture, especially for family farmers. And then we're also seeing the local food movements, which we mentioned up there, locally grown produce and things like that. Another change that we've seen to agriculture is a rise in urban agriculture. And this has largely been in response to urban sprawl. So here is our definition of urban sprawl. It's from Unit 7, so we haven't covered it just yet. Okay, unrestricted growth in many American urban areas of housing, commercial development, and roads over large expanses of land with little concern for urban planning. Now, we've seen this especially in areas kind of in the Midwest. There's a great video case study on Chicago and how the rapid suburbanization has encroached on some of the best agricultural land in that area surrounding Chicago and in Illinois. And so this has been in response to that, a way to try and address the loss of agricultural land. So some of the benefits, as you can see there, is that it's not going to require as much land because typically it is more vertical farming, farming up a building or in a large single area, because what we're going to talk about in our urban unit with a bid rent theory says that it's going to cost a lot of money to have land in an urban area. And so in order to make this productive for agriculture, we have to grow up. In addition, it's typically going to not require as many fertilizers. It's going to employ more people simply because you can't have the same labor-saving machines that we have on these huge expanses of land. And so it has to be more intensive, which means more people have to work in agriculture. And it would greatly diminish transportation costs, something that we talked about in von Thunen's locational theory. And so that's important. Now, on the drawback side, we need new technology because the technology that we have isn't going to be conducive to this. The technology we have right now covers huge expanses of land. That's not what we're talking about now, especially with urban agriculture. Again, because we have fewer machines, it's going to require more people. So people are going to have to make that shift to agriculture. That might change the hierarchy as far as income and economics when it comes to that. And there might be more limited crops because it might not be something that is conducive to certain types of crop. Corn or wheat, where we have huge fields of it, may not be able to grow in an urban area. So we might have to kind of shift things around a little bit. Livestock. Are we going to be able to have these huge stockyards in the middle of an urban area? So things might have to change there, all right? But new ideas might be the way to make those changes moving forward. So the question that I have here on our last, second to last issue regarding agriculture is, I have a question for you. If you have access to a resource, okay, think of whatever resource it is, whether it's agriculture, whether it's oil, silver, lumber, whatever it is. If you have access to a resource, do you, the individual, maximize your individual gain? Do you try and get the most out of that resource that you can? Okay. Now, what if by doing that, you end up exhausting that resource? You don't have any more of it. Would you still do it? Because that is what the tragedy of the commons is, and it is something that is associated with agriculture, but as well as other things like oil, like other primary sector activities. So here's the definition. The observation that in the absence of collective control over the use of a resource available to all, it is to the advantage of all users to maximize their separate shares, even though their collective pressures may diminish total yield or destroy the resource altogether. So, this is one of the struggles regarding, since we're talking about agriculture, okay, it's something where with more and more people having access to these materials, people are going to continue using and using and using and using. And because that is in their individual best interest. Now, we've already talked about some of the effects of that, some of the environmental effects of that, and how that gave rise to sustainable agriculture. Right? But then you might ask, you hear collective control, and you're like, wait, who's going to be controlling this? And that's become kind of the struggle. Okay? When is it okay to tell someone that they're doing too much? And that's the question that I certainly don't have the answer to. And that you as the individual have to decide at what point do we say enough is enough? Your personal gain is too much. And that's for you to decide, not me, to be clear. All right? But that's the struggle that comes with this concept of the tragedy of the commons. And it is a question that, if we're able to answer, could mean huge changes when it comes to agriculture and sustainable agriculture and things like that. The last topic regarding agriculture this evening is about the changing face of agriculture. Globally, women constitute about 43% of the agricultural labor force. But to be clear, those numbers tend to be significantly higher in LDCs than they do in MDCs. The women constitute a much smaller proportion of the agricultural labor force in MDCs. In LDCs, it could be as high as 70% of the labor force are occupied by women. Right? And so a lot of times, one of the things that has been examined, and it is the focus of Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Organization of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has been working on trying to address some of these imbalances, because while many women work the land, oftentimes they lack the voice to be able to make decisions about that land. And I'm going to give you guys some examples here. Like, what do you mean by that? And even just the concept of working the land is a source of contention. Like, what do you mean when we say working the land? We're going to take a look at that. All right. So as more and more women engage in agriculture, we're starting to see major changes occur. All right. And as people progress, we're seeing changes. As countries develop, as women have greater access to economics, have greater access to education, we're seeing changes here. So we're seeing changes in demography. We're seeing changes in migration patterns. We're seeing changes in the level of economic development. We're seeing changes in education and access to education. All right. All of these are major topics that have to be addressed and of concern as we move forward. So a couple different things here. All right. This is a poll that was conducted in two countries, the Dominican Republic and in the Caribbean, and India in South Asia. And this is looking at the estimates of the proportion of women who are, quote, economically active. All right. And what we mean when we say economically active, the green areas are considered economically active and the red areas economically inactive. So the conventional survey in the Dominican Republic say that only 21% of women are economically active, whereas in India it's 27%. Now, there is another survey that was conducted, what they called a gender-sensitive survey, and they had that asterisk there that says the gender-sensitive survey includes gardening and animal care in both countries, as well as in India, the collecting of firewood. All right? And so when we change that, when we include those as economic activities, in the Dominican Republic, 84% of women are economically active. In India, 60% of women are economically active. All right, and remember the changes that would come about with this. With greater economic control, we see changes in birth rates. We see changes in fertility rates. We see migration patterns begin to shift. Level of development change. With greater access to income, we see greater levels of education open up. All right, so with this, I want to remind you what we saw in the video case study on DCAT Pura. And in that video case study, they said that women were largely responsible for weeding the fields. which is necessary to ensure that those soil nutrients aren't depleted by the weeds and instead are going to the crops to ensure that you're getting the most yield on that parcel of land. Okay, but according to the conventional survey, that wouldn't be considered economically active. Though, as we just pointed out, and as we have already seen, it is of vital importance to the economic output from those crops. So, to add another statistic here, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is the FAO, 90% of all hand weeding that is done in sub-Saharan Africa is done by women. But would that be included on a conventional survey? Would those women be counted as economically active? Well, no. Finally, the last image that we have here is the percentage of agricultural work that is carried out by women compared with the percentage of female extension staff in certain selected African countries. Now, first thing that we have to understand is what extension staff is. And essentially, extension staff assists with training and working with new crop varieties, new technologies, all right? And so essentially what this image shows us is that female farm workers dramatically outnumber the amount of females who are working to help improve agricultural output, okay? Training new crop varieties and new technologies, all right? To build on this, a couple other statistics that we can use. According to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, only 15% of the world's agricultural extension agents are women. That female farmers receive only 5% of all agricultural services in 97 countries. Okay? That female farmers aren't getting that resource. They're not getting that training. They're not getting those materials. And that only 10% of total aid for all agriculture, forestry, and fishing go to women. 10%. So this whole lecture has been about the impacts of agriculture and some of the changes and impacts of that. So hopefully we now have a better sense of the way that agriculture impacts a lot of different things. And we'll talk about it in class. Have a good night. I'll see you next class period.